Okay, so for this module, Module 3, we're going to be talking a little bit about evil, um, specifically as a sort of moral category. One that sort of has to be employed when it seems like saying someone is what they did was very bad um, is just not enough. It's not an extreme enough sort of word for what happened. And so the first paper that we're going to read and that we're going to talk about is one by Hannah Arendt, who is a very famous philosopher. She was born in Germany in the early 1900s. She was Jewish, and so she ultimately fled Germany during World War II. She spent some time in France. She ended up in the United States. And she's probably best known for her writing about totalitarianism. So she wrote a lot about she was a sort of a political philosopher, and she wrote a lot about totalitarianism in response to the atrocities of World War II. So her most well-known theory is called the Banality of Evil thesis. And the Banality of Evil thesis is essentially the idea that a person does not have to seem, they don't have to have the appearance of a villain, and they don't have to sort of embody a sort of caricature of moral monstrosity in order to do evil, unspeakable things. So I'm sure many of you have seen, various children's movies in which the evil, the villain, just looks vicious, and they do horrible things constantly, and they're cruel in their interpersonal life. They're not a good family member, etc. But she's saying a person does not have to seem morally monstrous in this personal way in order to participate and ultimately facilitate really evil actions. And so one case study that she uses to make this point is that of Adolf Eichmann. And so for this course, I'm having you read this essay that was originally published in the New Yorker before being developed into a chapter of a larger book. But Adolf Eichmann was a Nazi bureaucrat. So he was not, fighting on the battlefields, but he was sitting at a desk, and he was also responsible for organizing the transportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to Nazi death camps. So he wasn't the only one organizing this, but he was a massive organizer of transportation of Jewish people to their deaths. So he, I think people want to say Adolf Eichmann was evil. He did a very evil thing. And so the essay in which I assign, like I said, it's originally published in the New Yorker, but you'll find that she describes Eichmann as a fairly ordinary, even boring person. So she describes him as sort of lacking in any special qualities. Maybe he had sort of an ambition. He had a sort of ambition to him. He wanted to be successful. And she talks about some of his career paths and how even during this sort of career rise that he was sort of on since his young adulthood, how he had also received help from Jewish businessmen, and he had had connections with Jewish people through sort of extended family and things. And so she wants to draw out this idea that Eichmann was not a morally, he didn't have a strong moral conviction, a sort of evil conviction to him. He just sort of facilitated and participated in this extremely evil atrocity, this incredibly vicious historical event. And so, like I said, she offers these details about his personal life. She describes him as this mundane person who committed evil deeds while lacking in a sort of deeper evil personal conviction. And so this is very controversial, and she gets a lot of pushback against this. I mean, basically her idea is one that is echoed elsewhere, which is that seemingly ordinary people under the certain circumstances can do really evil things. And so, like I said, this is very controversial. To many people, it seemed like this thesis failed to really account for the atrocities of the Holocaust, and it seemed to maybe excuse some of the people who were responsible for major atrocities. It seemed to maybe offer a kind of moral excuse, or to sort of free them from a more extreme moral condemnation, which people wanted to say, how could somebody who lacked an evil conviction do the things that Adolf Eichmann did? And so many people did not find this convincing. They thought, anyone in Eichmann's position had to be a moral monster. They had to be evil in their core as an individual, as a character trait, and that it was not simply the sort of coalescing of a number of circumstances that sort of allowed for something like this to happen. And so there's another video under the reading section about the Milgram experiment, which is in sort of echoes Hannah Arendt's, or kind of wants to explore something similar to Hannah Arendt's theory about the banality of evil, which is sort of interesting. And so brings us back to this idea of, why are people talking about evil at all? And so this Milgram experiment is done in the 1960s. And one of the reasons that people are talking about evil, both philosophers are talking about evil, psychologists are interested in this concept, is that people are trying to make sense of the Holocaust. So it was such a world-shaking event that people were really concerned with trying to understand, how could this happen? How could something on such a mass scale happen to this degree? And so, like I said, Stanley Milgram does a sort of famous experiment which sort of sought to highlight the idea, again, that average people were capable of performing morally evil acts under certain conditions. And so he's really concerned with the idea of obedience to authority, and how that affects how people act. And so in Milgram's experiment, which is run in the 1960s, subjects are asked to administer shocks to another person under the guise of working on a memory task. So they're trying to say, listen, you're going to see if you can help this person learn either a certain word or some sort of memorization task. And so subjects are encouraged by experimenters in their nice white lab coats to administer higher and higher voltages of electricity to this person who they just believe is another random stranger participating in the study. Now, the person who is supposed to be getting these electric shocks is actually an actor. And during this process, the person, the actor, starts to protest more and more. They start to say, stop. In some cases, they say, I have a heart condition. You might see some of this in the video. And they scream in pain. And despite these protests, despite all this evidence that you as administering shocks are causing this other person immense pain, they're begging the experiment to stop, Milgram found that about 2/3 of the individuals in the study were willing to administer a dangerous, potentially lethal dose of electricity. And he used this, so despite all these protests, and so he used this to make a point about people's willingness to obey authority figures as it relates to the capacity of ordinary people to do horrible things. So for the next reading, in the next video, I'm going to talk about a sort of alternative theory to Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil thesis, and there's a lot of pushback out there to this thesis, but I think it's really interesting to think about, and I encourage you all to think about questions related to how authority, or how being a member of certain institutions or certain groups might encourage people to act in really horrifying ways that they might not otherwise act. And also to think about, your own views on evil. When you think of someone who's done something really morally atrocious, do you think that it requires that that person be, as an individual, morally evil? Do you think there's other things that can account for that? And what does that sort of mean for you? So I encourage you to think about all that.